We are going to be doing another Church Next conversation here, week 2, coming up in a few minutes, and I'm really looking forward to it. Sit tight, hang out, and we're going to have a good time. Hope you guys have all been having a good COVID season. It's been such a interesting time, I know, for many of us. But I have really enjoyed that it's made having conversations like this a little bit easier. And I can't wait to talk about today. We got such great stuff today. So I'll be back in a little bit and go ahead and pop on here. Here's a little bit of brief putty trivia. I have gotten very excited about cold brew coffee since this whole COVID season started, and so I have been enjoying cold brewing coffee at home. That's kind of become my new habit. So yeah, just kind of random, kind of fun. All right, and it's time to go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody who is here. It's so good to see you guys. Today, we're going to pick up and we're going to keep talking about Church Next, which is what we are here to talk about today. We've got some great stuff to get through today. I cannot wait to talk about this. I cannot wait to talk about the Q&A, and so please, like, already as we're going through, be thinking about your questions. I'm very excited about Q&A with this subject, and so let's just go ahead and jump right on in. Hello to everyone who's joining. Love all the greetings, and just love to all of you, and thanks for joining. Feel free to share this. I know this is really kind of unique and different content, and really excited to get this stuff out there. So what are we talking about here? Well, Jay, good morning from Australia. Very nice. We are working our way through the content of the Church Next e-course, and we're going to be kind of taking it section by section, hitting some of the summaries, some of the top level, and then I'm referring you to please engage with the e-course content in more depth to really do a deep dive here. The e-course is free. It's going to be free. There's no upsell. This is not a marketing gig. This is a attempt to get good ideas out there. And so if someone could assist me, I should have looked it up and posted it, but someone could put that e-course link in there for anyone who might be on here and has not signed up for the e-course. That would be super cool. But let's go ahead and let's jump in. So last week, we talked about how we have a unique journey ahead of us. And it's a journey of really allowing ourselves to see the gospel in a new way, to see faith and church in a new way, and to allow the Lord to perhaps stretch us into some new things that he's doing in the world right now. We talked about how to do that safely, some tips for the journey, how do we do that without veering into heresy, things like that, important questions. We're not going to talk about that anymore. If you want more on that, revisit the e-course or the previous Q&A session. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start that journey. And we're going to do that by looking at present at our current challenging reality. So a couple of different facets, couple of different elements of this. The first is this. Our world, and I should say this was true long before COVID, and COVID is just one more step in a sequence that's been going for a long time of the fact that our world is changing more rapidly, more dramatically than it has for quite a long period of time. If you look at the rate of technological change, the rate of development of the way that things are working, if you look at the preponderance of science and knowledge and technology, every single one of these is not just moving quickly, they are moving fast and they are accelerating in their rate. It's kind of a funny thought, perhaps to consider, but it actually wasn't all that long ago that someone who studied a specific field could understand roughly the entirety of the field. Like an expert in biology could basically stay in touch with the majority of biology. And nowadays, that's not true. An expert in biology knows this tiny narrow slice because the whole field is just developing so fast that no single person can actually understand it all. If we think about technologies and the way technology is moving, I mean, just think about these ideas, these words that we're hearing these days. Ideas like quantum computing, and the fact that, like, for all the ways that computers and so forth have changed our lives, let's invent just a whole new class of computers that's going to do a whole completely different set of things at the same time as these computers continue to change our lives. Who knows how that's going to change the world? Biological engineering, genetic engineering. I mean, we're talking about programming the DNA scripts of organisms. What does that even look like? Cryptocurrencies, financial things that don't belong to any specific nation or government. They belong to all people together. AI, artificial intelligence, that keeps developing, and who knows where that's all going to wind up going. That's just a couple of samples. And all of that was before this COVID situation hit, which we all know is going to continue to change society and culture. And so the first observation about our present reality is this, is everything is changing. And I think it's important for us to think about how to process that well, because there's two different kinds of change. There's qualitative change and there's quantitative change. And the two are very different. I think a good analogy it happens when we think about, I'm a scientist, so I'll take a scientific analogy. When we think about the way that water behaves, if you take water and you put it in the snow outside, that water is going to experience quantitative change as it starts cooling down. Maybe the water is 60 degrees. You took it out of the tap, 60 degrees. It starts cooling down. It's experiencing quantitative change. It is changing. The water is getting colder, but that change isn't a dramatic kind of change in the way that the water behaves. It still behaves like water. It's just a colder version of water. But once you hit 32, you experience qualitative change, and the water goes from water to ice. And now it behaves entirely differently. Now, the kind of change that you're looking at has nothing to do with the kind of change from 60 degrees to 55 degrees. It's entirely different. Now, what's fascinating about that, a phase transition is what that's called, water moving to ice, is that you have the same exact H2O molecules before and after the phase transition. And it's the same with steam too. The molecules themselves don't change. The ingredients are exactly the same. But it's the way that these ingredients organize themselves that changes the sort of big picture behavior of the fact that ice is a solid, water is a liquid, and steam is a gas. What we are experiencing, what I want to suggest, what we are experiencing in society is not just qualitative change, or sorry, not just quantitative change, but the qualitative kind of change. We are experiencing a society that is not mostly staying the same, but changing in some degree, like water when it's cooling down. What we are experiencing in our world right now is the qualitative kind of change where the ingredients are still the same. We're still people. We still, we have relationships. We have our resources. We have our technologies. All of that is true. But the way that these things are adding together is producing a completely different large-scale result for the way that the world works. And that's why it's exhausting to try to keep up with all of this change, because it's not just change within the same framework, it's that the framework itself is changing. And so that means everything is changing. This is why every direction you look at is fundamentally becoming different. The sciences are changing, economics is changing, government is beginning to change, the way we works is beginning to change. Every field is beginning to change because we are going through this kind of qualitative change, this phase transition change. Our world is moving from water to ice, or from ice to water, or something like that. The way it all fits is going to be very, very different and distinct. And so I think that's important for us to observe. The world has gone through these qualitative changes before. We're going to look at one of them in a little bit later. So this isn't the first time this has happened, and that's why we can look at other times and say, oh, okay, this is sort of like that, where it's not just things changing within the same context, the context itself is changing. Okay, so that's the first idea, that we're experiencing a societal phase transition or something like that. The question then, that is a really pertinent question for us to think about, is in the midst of that, what's happening with the church? And the truth is, it's a little hard to tell exactly because everything is changing so quickly. So wherever the church is today, it may not be in 3 weeks. And particularly in this COVID season, we don't know how that's all going to influence things. But what is clear is a couple of things. The first is this. There's some level of disengagement with the church societally when it comes to, say, Western culture. That's not true worldwide, but it is true in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, places that are defined by Western culture. And so there's some level of disengagement. Now, different people will disagree what that disengagement is. Some people are saying that it's not clear at all that there are any less believers. But what's happening is there's a bunch of kind of nominal people that went to church because they knew it was a good thing to do that are no longer going to church. And so you're losing the people who weren't really people of faith, but we still have the same number of true people who are on the journey with Jesus. Other people would dispute that and would say that's not true. I think regardless of where you land on that, the important question, or the key observation, is this. It is very clear that culturally, our culture is increasingly feeling tension with the church. If you think about, the 1950s or earlier, in the 1950s or earlier, it was generally viewed as a positive thing to be a Christian. You were thought that, oh, this person's going to be trustworthy, they're going to be honest, they're going to be hardworking, they're going to be loving and kind. These are the things that come to mind when you think of church or when you think of Christianity in 1950, say, or earlier. But what's fascinating is today, that's far from true. Today, the first things that come to mind are closed-minded, looking out for themselves, hypocritical. These are the kinds of things that come to mind when you think of Christianity, when you think of the church, when you think of faith. Judgmental, moralistic. All of these are the immediate first things that come to mind. In other words, not positive connotations, but negative ones. The church is not viewed as a positive thing in society and in culture. And there's a lot of different ways to process that. There's a lot of different elements that could be feeding into that. I do think the key idea, though, with respect to where we just left, our cultural conversation and what's happening in the world, is this. The world is going through a phase transition. It's moving from ice to water, let's say. The church, if the church is designed for the ice world and the church does not know how to live in the water world, that means that as the world makes that phase transition, the church is going to look and feel like the old world, not like the new world. And it's actually going to be something that feels like that's holding us back. That's not the future. That's not where we're headed. And so there's going to be a tension, a strain between the future that the world is growing into and the church, which is looked at, which is understood as a backward presence in the world that is holding us back, not leading us forward. Does that sound familiar? That sounds very familiar to me. And we can take that and try and cast it in more concrete terms. Society is losing its morality. And so the church as a force of morality is no longer popular. Yeah, maybe that's happening. But I think the bigger picture is the church has not found its way into the new world yet. And so there is no possible way that the church can feel like part of the future. It will feel like part of the past. It literally feels like the church is speaking another language that's no longer relevant. It's as if it's kind of a analogous to churches that would do their masses in another language. It's like, yeah, this isn't my life today. Well, that's as some version of that is kind of happening. Like we're speaking another language to the language that the world is moving towards as it moves into water world, so to speak. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at one of the places in history where the world did go through a phase transition and where the church did take the journey along with, and what happened. And one of the key examples, I think the clearest example of this, happens in the period of time that's sometimes referred to as the Reformation. Now, the Reformation happened about 500 years ago, and it was a period of time that was kind of kicked off in 1517 when this monk guy, Martin Luther, starts posing some questions for discussion. And he does that by tacking 95 Theses to a church door in Germany and says, I've got some questions. Let's talk about this. And what winds up happening is that winds up kind of unexpectedly becoming a tipping point that results in a new form of the church that gets divided off from the Catholic Church. So you have the Catholic Church and you have the Protestant Church. And the Protestant Church is essentially the expression of the church that fits the new world. And over the course of the next couple of hundred years, the message that Martin Luther gives and its embodiment in the church winds up being a key anchor point and a key leavening factor for the rebuilding and the reorganizing of society in the West. Now, let me give just a couple of more specifics on that in terms of how that works. In the time of 1517, Europe and the world is coming out of the Middle Ages. There's been about 1,000 years where the world hasn't changed much. It's mostly agrarian. You got a lot of farmers. You've got a few businesses. You've got the church at the center of town, and the world is very simple. The world is organized around institutions. And the way that you live in this world is you do what the institutions tell you to do. So you're a peasant, and when the king makes an order, you do what the king tells you to do. You go to church, and when the priest tells you to do something, you do what the priest tells you to do. When some other expert tells you to do something, you do what the institutions tell you to do. In other words, you're reliant, you're dependent on the institutions to essentially make decisions for your life for you. And this is viewed as a good thing. This is God's design. God chose the kings. God chose the priests. We're not supposed to question why. Ours is but to do and die, is essentially the the mentality, and this is viewed as God's design. This is God's structure. To us, that sounds horrible. That sounds completely backwards. That sounds demeaning and demoralizing, but that was natural, normal, and good in that day. Now, what happens is in 1440, this guy named Johannes Gutenberg invents this thing called the printing press. And that winds up being a critical event because with the printing press, books instantly go from super expensive to very cheap. And so books begin to flow throughout culture. And as that happens, ideas begin to flow throughout culture, which had not been happening before that. And as ideas begin to flow throughout culture, people start having to evaluate ideas and come to their own conclusions about what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And that begins to seed a value for I make decisions for my own life, which was not something that had existed up until that point. And when that idea begins to happen, all of a sudden, not long after that, you see this flowering that happens throughout the whole of society in this period of time called the Renaissance. All of a sudden, you've got some of the greatest artists in the world that are creating incredible works of art. You've got literature. I mean, this is the time of Shakespeare. You have exploration. Columbus discovers the new world. You have the sciences. Newton discovers, invents calculus invents physics. The sciences come on board, and astronomy has a revolution, and on and on and on. There's all of these kind of explosive revolutions that follow the seeding of the individual's value to think for themselves that happen within, say, 50 years of that printing press. And it is about 60 years after that printing press, 77 years to be more precise, I suppose, that Martin Luther comes along and says, hold on, guys, I have a question. Maybe this journey of faith is not about being dependent on the Catholic Church. Maybe I don't need to go to a priest to have him mediate my relationship with God. Maybe Jesus offered himself to become the mediator between God and man so that I can have a relationship with God directly. Maybe faith isn't supposed to be dependent on institutions, the way of the old world, but maybe faith is a personal journey that we're supposed to have between ourselves and God, the new world. And so Martin Luther comes along and introduces these ideas, and it's like the spark that kind of sets the world ablaze, because all of a sudden the world now has a theological and ideological anchor point for the value of the individual that has been sewn into culture for 50, 60 years at this point. This is why the Reformation happens the time that it does, the way that it does. We have a tendency to make a little bit too much, I think, of the man and of the message. There were other people that were speaking the exact same message with the exact same boldness. A man named Jan Hus, 100 years before Martin Luther, teaches the exact same stuff and dies. He gets martyred for it. He has the same message. He has the same boldness. What he does not have is the right message at the right time. And God has been leavening the world to step into a value for the individual. And Martin Luther comes along and says, hey, guys, faith is a personal matter between you and God. It's an individual thing, too. And the timing and the message are perfect together. And that's why, boom, it's this explosion of the founding of a new branch of church that is based on Jesus Christ being the sole, relator between us and God, personal faith in Jesus Christ, our personal Lord and Savior, all of these things. This is all the line, the tracing that gets us to this point. Now, when faith changes from something that church mediates to you to your own personal relationship with God, the purpose of church changes. Church now is no longer about mediating a relationship with God for you. It's not we will relate to God and you will relate to us, but rather the purpose of church becomes we're here to be your coach in your relationship with God and to be your connection point with other people on their relationship with God. And so church becomes about training, equipping. The sermon becomes the most important thing instead of the mass. And it becomes about connection and relationship. This is the legacy of church that Martin Luther establishes. And what he does is he puts a stake in the ground, says this is what faith is supposed to be, reinvents the church. This is what church is supposed to be. And that Protestant church that carries that message for the next couple hundred years is an anchor point for this core idea that the individual themselves has value before God. And that idea starts spreading and leaking out into Western culture. The idea, well, oh, hold on. If individuals have value before God, then maybe individuals ought to have their own resources and a say in the way that they spend those resources. And so not long after that, you have the idea of, for example, personal property. You have the idea of the free market and people having their own resources to spend the way they want to. And eventually what happens is capitalism comes out of that. It's directly tied to Martin Luther's ideas. In the area of government, a similar progression. The idea of government by representation comes about. Maybe if God values individuals, they ought to have a say in their own government. And so you have ideas like democracy and republics that come out of that thread. And all of that happens because of the leavening of this idea that is locked into society by Martin Luther and the church. So what happens here? Martin Luther is the tipping point that helps the church go from the old world of dependence on institutions to the new world of value on the individual. He helps the church navigate that, and then subsequently the church for 200 years becomes a force that helps Western society reinvent itself and subsequently shape the course of the globe. That's what's happened in the 500 years between Martin Luther and now. And so I look at that and I say, this is a deeply encouraging thing to look at, because we have seen a time when the world has gone through a phase transition from dependence on institutions to an independent, valued mindset. And in the midst of that, God had a perfect and incredible plan for the church, where the church discipled the nations in just about the most profound way possible. The world would not be what it was were it not for the Reformation, were it not for the ideas that Martin Luther said, this is what the Bible says, when he tacks it up on a church door in Wittenberg. So the Reformation is about the church moving into the next season, moving through the phase transition and being a presence of the future of the phase transition rather than the past of the phase transition. And what I want to argue, which I understand is a bold statement, but what I want to suggest here in Church Next is I believe that we in our day are in the midst of the beginning of a parallel type process, a process where God is taking the world through a phase transition. He's taking the world into a new shape, as it were. And the church has an opportunity to either stay in the old shape that we were, or allow the Lord to bring us into the new shape, the shape of the future. And if we do that, then we have the opportunity to be a leavening force and to disciple the nations the same way that the Protestant church discipled the West. We have an opportunity to disciple probably the globe at this point. But that's going to require us being bold. That's going to require us being willing to step into a new future and not cling to our old future or old past, which is kind of what we as the church have been known to do, unfortunately. Now, one last idea on this, and then we can go ahead and open up for some Q&A at this point. Now, here's the question that should probably be rolling around in our minds at this point. Well, what is that phase transition towards? What is God moving the world into so that we can understand what might we need to be moving towards as the church? That's a wonderful question. And of course, I cannot answer that in great specificity, but I think I can paint a few general features. And that will help us, I believe, on the continuing of this journey to know, okay, where are we heading as the church and how does all of that work? So if you look at the transition that happened with the Reformation in Martin Luther's day, I would suggest the key element is a change in the mindset and a change in the way society was organized, from organizing around dependence to organizing into independence as the key value. If you look at the message Martin Luther carries, it moves from you are dependent on the church to keep you good with God to you have a personal relationship with God himself. It's a shift from dependence to independence. And if you look at the subsequent ways that value has rippled its way out, you can see that we think in very independent terms. I mean, think about the founding document of the country that I live in, the United States. It's called the Declaration of Independence. If you think about the way the church behaves, we have this ongoing splitting of denomination after denomination, eventually resulting in the non-denominational church, the church that is completely independent, completely on its own, and not related to any other church out there. The key idea, the key feature is independence is the organizing feature that our world has organized around. But if you look at the way that human beings develop, we tend to go through phases of dependence to independence, but actually not stopping there, but moving forward from independence into what is called interdependence. A good example of this would be children. When our children are born, they're very dependent on us. They can't eat on their own. They can't dress themselves on their own. They can hardly fall asleep on their own. They're dependent on their parents for everything. But as we raise them, eventually we wean them off of dependence onto independence. At first we give them all the food, and then and we shovel it into their mouth. And then eventually we say, okay, well, here's the food, you put it in your own mouth. And then eventually we say, well, there's the fridge, you can get your own food to put in your own mouth. And finally we say, go get your own job so you can get your own food to put in your own mouth. We're moving them into independence. And this happens, of course, in every segment of life, not just how we feed ourselves. And the sort of like epitome of independence is the teenage years, when kids open up some space in the family to find out who they are, independent of mom and dad. And so before they love their parents, now they don't want to listen to their parents. Before they look to their parents' guidance, now they're not looking to their parents' guidance. They're looking to figure out, what do I think? What do I believe? And mom's or dad's guidance is actually a threat to me finding what I believe. And so I'm not interested in that. I'll listen to my peers, but I'm not interested in my mom and dad. And so there's this teenage phase that's very independent oriented. And that is normal and natural and okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That is how it's designed to work, but that's not the end state. The thing is supposed to continue until we grow into adulthood, where we can have interdependence, which, yes, we have discovered who we are, what we believe. We have found a sense of identity. What I believe is no longer threatened by the fact that you may believe something differently. But that being said, I don't cut myself off from others like teenagers are a little apt to do. Rather, I re-embrace relationship from the strength of a formed identity, and I allow myself to enter into relationships with others, knowing that you and I are different, and we have the capability to enrich our lives. I bring things to the table, and you bring different things to the table, and we can find win-win scenarios where we're better together than each of us are individually. And that's the point where we consider our children healthy adults. We graduate them into society. We say, get a job, move out of the house, and all of those kinds of things. And so there's this thing that happens from dependence to independence to interdependence. And you see the same thing happening when it comes to development in many times and places. Christians go through the same thing. They start as dependent, and they're like, I have to be in church every weekend. I kind of get saved again every Sunday. If I don't go to small group, I'm probably going to deconvert. They're dependent on their church to stay in the Christian walk. Then eventually they develop their own relationship with Jesus, and they might become spiritual teenagers. They open up a little distance. They say, well, it's just me and Jesus. I don't know what I think about the church, that kind of thinking. That's that independent phase. And maybe they distance from the church, maybe not. But either way, their relationship with Jesus doesn't orbit around the church anymore. It's a personal thing. And they may get a little obsessed with their own calling. They may be thinking that's what the church is supposed to be about. And eventually they can come to interdependence and realize, you know what? I'm best as a part of a body. I'm best as one member in a greater whole, that we each mutually enrich our lives. And I don't need the church to stay saved, but my life is enriched by being a part of the church. This sequence, dependence, independence, interdependence, is the way that we grow and flourish in our human lives. And what I want to boldly suggest is that I think the phase and the time that we're in right now is a time when the world is being leavened to move from independent orientations of mindsets and structures of society to interdependent mindsets and structures of society. Everywhere you look, the place where the world is feeling strained, it has to do with interdependence. You know, the world and the way that we even organize, say, our nations is very independently oriented. We have this idea of a sovereign nation, which is basically a very big version of an individual. I have these borders and you don't have any permission to do anything inside these borders. They're all my own. And that works as long as the nations aren't tightly tied together in a global economy where everything that one does affects another one. And when that happens, you have to try and solve interdependence problems. And so you create things like the EU to try and solve that. And is the EU working? Well, I don't know. Talk to someone in Europe. Some say yes, some say no, but either way, it's an interdependence problem trying to be solved. Or consider the fact that we as Americans are very frustrated by the fact that Russia has influenced our most recent presidential election. Well, that's because it's quite literally impossible to make them unable to do that. We cannot draw borders around our world and our nation anymore because, the interconnectedness of what? A disruptive technology. We have a disruptive technology that's not books that are allowing ideas to flow. It's this technology that we're communicating on right now that is allowing relationships to flow in ways they've never flowed before. At what other time in the world could I, sitting here in my basement, sit down with all of you and have a conversation wherever you are, even though physically we may be miles to hundreds to thousands of miles apart? That's never been able to happen before. Before that, connection was geographically locked in place. But now connection is beginning to flow non-geographically, just like ideas began to flow earlier and that changed society. Connections beginning to flow in new and unique ways, and that is straining society. All the models are beginning to feel tension and not know what to do with. And the people who are stepping into that future are exerting influence in the world. Think about the sort of key players in technology right now that are having a massive influence in the world. I think of companies like, basically, actually, if you look at almost any power player in the technology world, they're all leveraging this connection that's possible through technology to facilitate things that couldn't be done without technology, to basically dominate the world. Take Amazon. Amazon sells some of its own products, but mostly what Amazon does is it says, hey, you seller over there and you buyer over there, why don't you guys get together and I'll take 3% off the top or whatever it is. That model of allowing connections that couldn't be allowed before is actually grown Amazon to the biggest store in the world. Think of Uber, the biggest transportation company in the world. Same thing. Hey, driver. Hey, person who needs a ride. You couldn't find each other, but let me help you find each other, and you can create something. Google doesn't serve its own websites up the overwhelming majority of the time. Facebook isn't distributing its own content most of the time. Airbnb isn't using its own accommodations. I mean, you can just keep going over and over and over again. YouTube isn't serving its own videos. None of the major players that are forcing the world into the future are doing it based on their own contribution, independence. They're doing it based on the ability to make connections, interdependence that wasn't possible before. And so what I see is, to me, it feels like we have very parallel conditions to right before the Reformation happens. We've had a disruptive technology that is forcing a new flow in society that's not happened before. It's a flow towards an interdependence. It's a relational flow now. We have not just a new society, but the part of the world is stretching forward into that interdependence, and that's causing a tension with the church, which has not yet stepped forward into the interdependent world yet. We still have an independent world where to be saved is to have your own personal sin before God, but Jesus will become your personal Lord and Savior, so you can personally go to heaven when you die, and the whole rest of the world doesn't exist at all. That's our story. That's our mindset. That's our model, an independent one. Well, there's an opportunity here for us to step into a future of an interdependent expression of faith and an interdependent expression of the church, and in that disciple the nations. And so I believe we're primed for what, for lack of a better name, sometimes I call the interdependence reformation. I think there's a beautiful and incredible future for us ahead that matters so deeply, but it requires us being willing to take the massive steps forward, the massive leaps of qualitative change. And it forces us to do something that might frighten us, which is maybe the gospel needs to be understood from a different starting point, an interdependent starting point. Now, I'm not saying there's a different gospel, but what I'm saying is maybe there may be a different mindset from which to view the same thing, the same gospel, which may result in telling the story from a different starting point, emphasizing different elements, different layers, and allowing that new story to reshape the way that we think of church and what the church is, and allow that new story of an interdependent expression of faith, that new story of an interdependent expression of the church, allow that to be an anchor point that provides the same theological, the same ideological roots, so that the rest of the world can step into the interdependence that God is bringing the world into, but do it in the way that is after his design. That is the opportunity that we have in the midst of our challenging reality. Is it complicated? Is it difficult? Yes, it's crazy. But you know what it also is? It's historic. I mean, this opportunity comes around once every 500 years. What an incredible time to be alive, that God would allow us to be alive in the midst of a moment like this, that we could be part of stepping into something beautiful like this and seeing the discipleship of the nations, the discipleship of the globe into the ways of God. I am pumped. I'm excited. And so with that, I've rambled and all of that for a while. There is way more on that in the e-course. And so once again, if you haven't done that, jump on there. You probably have a zillion questions. We will address a few of them here with the time that we've got. And then I'll point you to the e-course, and I'll point you to our gathering together next week. And so let me read a few of these questions and see if there's any good questions to address here. If you've got questions, please go ahead and put them in the feed. Would love to talk about this a little bit. Sandy Rowe asked what that next phase is. We already talked about that as much as we know. Okay, Marie Lancaster had a good comment here. I think I can put this up. One of the barriers that impacts the church a worldview where I live is an eschatology that promotes independence from society and other nations. At its core is fear of being connected, being influenced by, instead of being the one who influences. Oh, that is such a great comment, Maria. Love that. And hello to you and all my wonderful, beautiful friends down there in Mississippi. Hope you guys are holding up well. Yes, I think you've highlighted a really important thing here, Marie. Eschatology really matters in this whole conversation. Now, what is eschatology? Eschatology is the way that you expect this whole human story to wrap up. And for whatever reason, at some point, it became fashionable in the church to believe that the way this whole thing is supposed to end is the world is supposed to get bigger and darker and more powerful, and the church is supposed to like hide more and more in the corner. And at the very end of all things, Jesus is going to come back and snatch us back and rescue us, and we will survive, and then he'll punish the big bad world. That is almost kind of the assumed understanding of the way that the world is supposed to end. And if that is what you're expecting, then yeah, it's like, why would I get involved with the world? Why would I get involved with all of these things? It's going to get bigger, badder, more powerful. The church is going to get weaker. I need to hole up and protect myself. That's the natural thought process in that thing. And yeah, I understand that. I think the thing that's really important for us to realize is that eschatology is by no means universal and has by no means been the consistent understanding of eschatology over the course of the church. Interestingly, in the time of the early church, when the church is being persecuted by the Romans, when believers are getting crucified and all these terrible things are happening, that wasn't what the church believed. They didn't believe that they were destined to fail. They believed that Jesus had been victorious, that Jesus was king, that Caesar was not king, and that the result would be that Jesus's rule, Jesus's kingdom would be victorious in the end. And so they believed that the kingdom of God was going to grow and expand and have great influence throughout the world, and that Jesus's kingship would be more and more realized until he comes back. That was actually the way that they believed, and that's been actually the majority view of the majority of the church over the last 20 centuries. Now, recently, that's changed somewhat. But I think the overall thing that I want to say about that is this. I am very cautious with an eschatology that positions me in a way that has a tendency to undermine the Great Commission. So if my expectation of the end times, which, just, can I be transparent for a second? The Jews practically had the Bible memorized and didn't see Jesus when he showed up. So, like, I don't know why we think we have the end times figured out. Like, let's be honest. I don't think the end times is going to go down the way anyone thinks it's going to. And I think if we have very specific expectations on that, I just urge caution with that. I'll suppose that way. But however we see that shaking down, if that is working against the clear things that Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all I've commanded with you. And behold, I will be with you always to the end of the age. I, victorious Jesus, who has authority over heaven and earth, will be with you always. If my eschatology is undercutting that Great Commission, then I'm writing a really big question mark over that. Because the Great Commission came straight out of Jesus's lips. Like, it was his command to the church. These are your marching orders until I return again. I'm not going to let an eschatological view undermine that. The Great Commission is more primary to my faith than any particular view of eschatology. And so if I have to write a question mark over one of them, I'm writing it over the eschatological view. I'm not writing it over the Great Commission. I want to be able to march into the Great Commission with great confidence and great faith, knowing this is what Jesus sent us to do. He is not cruel. He is not setting us up for failure. He has not lost. He's the victorious Jesus. I can do the things he sent me to do. So I could go on that for quite a while. I'll just pause with that. Suffice to say, and look to see any more questions or comments or whatever as we go. Thanks for that comment, Marie. Okay, any other questions? Katerina said something interesting. She says, I even think of the way we approach nature and creation. Agrarian is very dependent on nature. Industrialization, independent from nature, dominating nature. Confusion and hype and questions, tensions of climate change, etc., indicate a growing awareness of our interdependent relationship with nature. I think that's fair. I think that's a really good observation, Katerina. And I think that's definitely a good and true observation. I like that. Thanks for that. Okay, Georgina asks, the interdependence Reformation, how will change how we tell the good news? Yeah, I think in some ways that it will. I think it won't change the way we tell the good news in the sense that it becomes a different message. The good news hasn't changed, but I think the framing of that message is going to change, yes. And I think specifically what we've done Because let's suppose that the good news actually is interdependent, right? So interdependence is a big thing. And within interdependence, if you take any individual and you erase everyone else, you still have an individual. So there is individuals inside interdependence. What I want to suggest is what we should probably expect is that the good news might actually be bigger and richer than the story we're used to telling, but that if we took that bigger, richer story and we erased the rest of the world and we reduced it just down to myself only, that I should probably get pretty close to the same thing that I'm used to thinking of as the gospel. So I would say it will change the way we tell the good news, and that it will enlarge and broaden it and make it more inclusive, but it will contain the good news we're used to. It just won't be limited to the good news that we're used to. So I think that's probably what we should expect. And as we continue to go through the course, that is exactly what we're going to be fleshing out. What then is the gospel from an interdependent point of view? That is where we are headed for the rest of this course. So stay tuned and keep engaging. Okay. I see. Oh, hold on. I had it. Some Hananiel. I'm sorry. I don't quite maybe know how to pronounce your name. You said you had a question about heresy. Not sure where to post it. Just go ahead and post it here. If you have it later, I'd love to address that. Jay asks this: do you think the anxiety cycle is preventing individuals from transitioning from an independent to an interdependent mindset? If so, how do you address that? That is such a great question, Jay. I love that question. Actually, I'll leave that up. I think that is such a fantastic question. And the answer is, I think, I'm kind of shooting from the cuff here, but I think, yes, there will definitely be people that because of the anxiety of all the change, because of the anxiety of the uncertainty in the world, will cling to the old instead of embracing the new. That happens every time there's change. And so I think by default, there is definitely some of that happening. Yes. How do you address that? Well, I think honestly that it's conversations like this. It's like, okay, after this conversation, it's my hope that you're going to be processing all the change in the world differently, and you might be able to see it with a little bit less fear and a little more understanding. That like, oh, actually, God is the one changing the world. I don't need to be afraid of the way He's taking the world. So like, we can like drain a lot of the fear out of the conversation, and oh, the future might be somewhere God is sending me to, not something to be avoided. That's actually a lot of the tone of the church that I hear these days. It's like, wherever the world is headed is bad. We're sure of that. So we got to fight to protect the good old days. That is based on not understanding what God is doing. And so I think the biggest thing we have to do is have conversations about understanding, because that's what diffuses the anxiety. That's what allows us to start saying, oh, okay, maybe God is up to something in this. Maybe I need to be looking for Him in this instead of trying to hide from this and find Him over here instead. I think conversation, I think talking is a big part of this. And this is partly why I'm trying to be so proactive to get this stuff out there, because I think it really makes a difference. Okay, continuing down. Linda has a question, which I'll read the rest of. I know I can't see all of it there. Since we've switched to online small groups and prayer during COVID, I've been seeing the benefits of connection through Zoom. We literally have people attending group who could never get to us physically. How do I utilize this momentum to partner, and it continues, with God in this phase change? That's a great question. And I think, what this whole COVID thing is doing is it's just, it's going to be an accelerant towards the interdependence. It's not causing it. Actually, in the grand scheme of things, isn't actually a major event. I don't think in the way that the world is changing at the broad scale we're talking about here. But it will result in the acceleration of some tactical layers of it. Like workplaces are going to start realizing we don't all have to work in the same building. Small groups are going to start realizing we don't all have to get together physically. Now, how do we transition forward out of this? That is a wonderful question that I'm not sure off the cuff I really have a great answer for. I think the kind of creative thinking that's been sparked here, I think that's probably the key thing. Is like, okay, once we're no longer in the situation where we have to think creatively like that, that doesn't mean we don't have to stop thinking creatively. It just means we have to choose to keep thinking creatively. And I think that's actually the key idea. Will we choose to keep thinking creatively to allow technology to facilitate the interdependence that it alone can create? Like, as in, will we value the interdependence for itself, or will we say, well, it's just easier to go back to usual? And that's actually the thing I'm worried about with all this COVID stuff, is like, once things relax and society goes back to normal, is the church will go, okay, great, we can go back to the normal thing we're used to. If we do that, I think actually we as a church have kind of like missed a little bit of the point. This is actually supposed to help us branch into new areas that we're not supposed to go back to our normal from. And so I think hopefully this will allow us all to see the potential of things where we can begin to explore, okay, now how can we really move into an interdependent expression of church? Because what we're doing right now still isn't interdependent, in my opinion. We're using technology to do the same independent expression of church. And you can see that because we've just copied the same thing that we're doing, and we're doing it digitally instead of in a whole different way. Okay. Great question, Linda. Hannah Neal, and again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Enjoyed listening to week one, parts of the course. Congratulations on putting together another excellent, well-researched research and material and giving it away for free. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to read the rest of it, which unfortunately you can't see here. Your section on emergent systems reminded me of the emergent church, Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, etc. At the time, it was announced as heretical by John Piper and all from the Reform movement. I also noted your mention in passing that the church, as it is emerging, needs to be in the mainstream of theological acceptance. So the question I have, who decides what is mainstream or commonly accepted theology, and how does the church and an individual guard against heresy? Oh, I love that question. That is such a good question and such an important question. I think the key thing here is this. When God births something new, there will be a lot of people that label it heresy because it's different. That's actually really a shame to me, because I think there's a whole lot of people who try to police the church who use the term heresy far too loosely. You believe something different from me is not heresy. Like infant baptism, I don't really believe in infant baptism, but that is not heresy. It's not heresy just because it's a different belief. Heresy would be Buddha can get you to heaven just like Jesus. That would be heresy. Like, but infant baptism is not heresy. It's a different belief. It's a different stance on what baptism is. Heresy is when we leave the message of Jesus Christ as the savior of the world, of God has initiated salvation. God has opened up salvation to us, and we receive that salvation from him. When we have left that message, that's when we're in heresy. The details of that message, there's a lot of room for different people to believe different things on that. And so the first thing I would say is this. We need to discern the difference between actual heresy and the heresy hunters labeling something heresy. Because there's a group of people that are quick to call other things heretical. I think what I would say to kind of more generally suggest this is this. I think what we'll see a broad swath of the church make some steps into that future. And so you'll probably have people from a bunch of different elements of the church who are stepping into there. You'll see some of the Reform step in there. You'll see some of the charismatic step into there. You see some of the mainline domination step in there. You see some of the Catholic step into there. There'll be this kind of idea that like this thing is appealing to much of the church together. Now, the people who do not step into that future will probably condemn that future. They'll probably label it as something pejorative and negative. And so I'm not saying something here that is universally accepted or universally celebrated. Let me put it that way, universally celebrated. What I'm saying is we'll see a large portion of the church, the people who can step into the future are going to step into the future. What we won't see is some tiny little pocket of people who are like, we've got the future and all whole rest of the church is wrong. And that the whole rest of the church goes, you guys are crazy. This isn't what God is doing. That's the situation we're not going to see. There's not going to be like one tiny little like person who's got their landmark on the truth and they've got it and everybody else is mistaken. I don't think what we're going to see is have that. We're going to have a broad section of the people of God who God himself is going to be moving into that new future. Now, another section of people are going to condemn that future, and that is going to be one of the tricky parts. And we do need to know what actual heresy is and how all that works. When we talk about emergent systems, emergent church, and all that, we're going to talk more about that as we go. So I won't dive into that now. I hope that is somewhat helpful. I do think that it is important for the people who are deciding, you know what, I want to take this journey, to kind of square on the front side. There may be some people who might throw heresy words at you, and to sort of count the cost and say, I'm going to have to be willing to evaluate and say, actually, I disagree with you. And I'm gonna, but there's nothing I can do about the fact that you're going to label me that way. That's up to you to decide how you label me. Either way, I'm going to love you. That's probably the loving Christian response to that. I hope that helps. We can continue to talk more about that as we make our way through the course. Okay, Katarina asks this question: how do we handle making good decisions in a world where we are more and more aware of how my decisions affect not only me, but potentially reach out and affect people I don't even know and I'm not aware I'm affecting? This is an interdependence question that you're asking right here, and I love that. It's, okay, how do I make decisions in an interdependent world is really what you're asking. And that's a wonderful question. And that is the kind of question that I think is going to get teased out as we figure out this whole journey. Like, as we understand the gospel from an interdependent point of view, it ought to give us some tools to begin to deal with questions like this. And so I'm going to kind of beg off on this question as we go. Perhaps if there's a good point, maybe bring it back up again. But I think this is the kind of thing that we're going to wind up seeing as we go, that the interdependence of our world is forcing us to say, I don't know how to answer that question right now. And the truth is yes, that's true, because society's been built on this idea of the individual who lives in the vacuum, whose life doesn't touch the lives of other people around them. And that is no longer the way the world works. Okay. Gonna see if there's room for maybe like one more question here. There's a couple of sort of comments that are saying this is good and rich and helpful and all that. That's really good. Okay. Hannah Neal has another question. You've got great questions. I appreciate these. Definitely communication is shrinking geographical distances, but increasing ideological differences. Yes, that's true. The problem in church and unity is different voices in the church are saying different things, ideological bubbles in the church. And church outreach needs centralization, budgets and resources to send people for outreach. How does an individual who is more on I don't need a church to feed me, participating in reaching the world with the gospel? Or in this new world, how does one get sent? How do you lay hands? How does ministry happen without intimate connection? I think that is a great question, and one that is kind of driving into some layers of tactical question that I don't think are going to be helpful to get into yet, because there's a lot more to come in terms of what the interdependent gospel looks like and what interdependent church looks like, and therefore what ministry ought to be done by the people of the church. All of that kind of needs to get laid out before that can be really dove into. I will say one thing about that. You're right, I think, in that It does appear that there are increasing ideological distances. The sort of quote unquote camps within Christianity feel like they are coalescing increasingly. There's like, there used to just kind of be this broad spread. Now it's like there's pocket here, there's pocket here, there's pocket here, pocket here. And each of those pockets are kind of self-reinforcing and getting more consistent with themselves and more different from the other pockets themselves. And I think what I want to suggest is that it might be that that is actually what God is doing, and that that is part of the road to interdependence. One of the problems of our independent mindset is we have not, as the church, learned how to process those people over there believe something different from me outside of they must be wrong and I must be right. And what I want to suggest is I think we've missed the boat a little bit on the way that God is using the church and the different expressions of the church. We tend to form an antagonistic idea of different expressions of the church rather than a potentially positive expression. And this is something we're going to continue to explore as we go. But what if I were to provide this alternative way of processing the fact that it feels like there's ideological distances that are growing within the church? What if I was going to say this? What if there is no singular expression of church that actually represents the sum total of what God is? AKA, what if there's not one picture of the body of Christ, but there have to be many, because God is something that cannot be imaged in one picture alone? And what if God has allowed different facets of his character and indeed different elements of grace to rest upon different segments of the church, which have shaped the way that those sets of people understand the gospel and understand this thing called Christianity? And what if they could process those things not from the lens of, I have the true faith and you are deceived and distorted, but what if we could process those things as, I understand that there's a unique grace that has been given to this segment of the church to know God as blank, but this segment of the church over here knows God as blank different, which is not the same as me. And maybe rather than getting in an antagonistic war and asking questions like who's right and who's wrong, might it be that knowing God could result in us seeing faith differently, and that that's actually not a bad thing? Put another way, what about this? Jesus has 12 disciples, right? Are not the relationships with each of those 12 disciples distinct and different? Did he know Simon Peter the same way that he knew John? Did he know John the same way he knew Matthew? Did he know Matthew the same way he knew Thaddeus or Simon or whoever? He had distinct and different relationships with each of the 12, aka each of those 12 disciples knew Jesus as a different person to them. That's just how relationships work. The relationship I have with my wife is different than the one I have with each of my children, which are all different from one another, which are different from my friends and my coworkers and other people. I'm a different person in the context of the different relationships that I have. And maybe it is that God has allowed that to exist in the church itself. And maybe we could learn to be students of one another rather than attacking one another. Maybe we could go, you know what? I don't actually agree with all of their theology, but for example, I grew up in the Reformed church. I no longer have Reformed theology. I don't believe that's the way that the sovereignty of God works out. But I will say this, the Reformed church knows something about trusting God when you do not know what is going on that is an incredible revelation. And I would do really well to learn from my Reformed friends what it's like to trust God when things are confusing and hard. When it looks like nothing in the world makes sense right now, the only response is to let go and to trust God and say, God, you must have good in this that I do not see. That is the only response that makes sense in some situations. And I could view my Reformed brothers and sisters in Christ as a repository of knowing God that way. Or I can view them as yeah, that's those people are confused. I've got the real answer on the sovereignty of God, as if I am not confused in some ways that I can't see and I'm not blind to, as if knowing the infinite God is something I can do perfectly. I'm sure there's areas I don't. And so I think these different ideologies, as you said them, are actually not a bad thing. We just need to learn to work with them and allow them to actually stitch us together, to value the differences, not see the differences as a negative thing or something that is a problem to be solved. It's not a problem to be solved. The church has always been about diversity within unity. One body, many members, right? And those members are different from one another. That has always been the design. It has always been an interdependent picture like this. And for those of us who are willing to take a step into the interdependent future, we can learn to process the church like that. And now all of a sudden that begins to be a model for the way that the world can begin to work through some of those same kinds of tensions. Okay, so there's a few thoughts kind of off the cuff. I hope that was fruitful. I hope that was helpful. It's been like 70 minutes, so I'm sure you guys all have good things to get to. I'm seeing a lot of good friends on here. Just want to say hi to each one of you. Love you guys. Thank you for joining. Again, if you haven't gotten the course, please jump on. It's free. It will always be free. Just trying to get the word out to share some of the ideas here. If someone would post that link again, maybe just one more time for our friends who've just recently joined. And this has been great. I have totally loved this Q&A time. I just bless you guys. We're going to gather again in about a week, and we'll pick up with section 3, where we're beginning to explore, oh goodness, what is section 3? I don't remember. We're beginning to explore, I think, the triune gospel and the individual or something like that. But I'm looking forward to that. I think it'll be about the same time next week. And, follow the Facebook event if you want to see that. But love you guys. Bless you guys. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy. And I just pray that may Jesus just absolutely be blessing you and meeting you in just such rich and beautiful ways in this COVID season. There is just a wonderful invitation for us to really just sit at the feet of Jesus and connect with him. And I just bless each and every one of you with that. And hope to see many of you next week. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining.